and welcome to today's STERIS Tech Talk on distribution testing for sterile packaging and devices. STERIS Tech Talks are a series of webinars covering subjects relating to gas and radiation sterilization processing and the laboratory testing and validation services which support these processes. My name is Ashley Maroot, and I'm the Associate Product Manager for STERIS Applied Sterilization Technologies. I'll be the host for today's event. Our presenter today is Nate Wilhelm. Nate is a Senior Project Engineer at Brooklyn Park, Minnesota Laboratory. He has 15 years experience in the medical device field, including 8 years at STERIS, and has held various engineering and project management roles covering medical device packaging, validation, sterilization, and manufacturing. All attendees are on mute for the presentation. However, we would like to encourage everyone to submit questions using the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. Questions will be answered following the presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to our STERIS Applied Sterilization Technologies YouTube channel. Please note that continuing education credits are not provided as part of this webinar. And now over to Nate to begin the presentation.
All right, thank you, Ashley. So as Ashley mentioned, I'm Nate Wilhelm. I'm Senior Project Engineer at STERIS's Brooklyn Park, Minnesota Laboratory. And today we're talking about distribution testing for sterile packaging and devices. We'll go through our agenda here briefly for the webinar today. We're going to start by learning a little bit about STERIS. We're going to go through some of the reasons for testing and go through ISO 11607, which is the primary standard regarding packaging validations. We're going to go through common distribution tests and some recent updates to ASTM D4169, which is one of the more common standards followed for distribution testing. About STERIS is Brooklyn Park Laboratory. We do a bunch of different testing here at this laboratory. We do microbiological and chemistry testing to support STERIS' sterilization services that we offer. We do disinfection efficacy testing. We have moist and dry heat sterilization services. We do some medical device validation services, including reusable device qualifications. And we do sterile package testing and validation services, which is what our focus today is on. And we do primarily service the medical device and pharma industries. I wanted to draw attention as well to STERIS's Galway, Ireland laboratory. They also do all the package testing that we're going to talk about today, distribution testing, accelerated and real-time aging, and all the package integrity tests. So if you have any counterparts or divisions over in Europe, our Galway, Ireland facility is there to support you. So why test? Testing is intended to show the safety and efficacy of your device, and it's primarily linked to submissions to regulatory bodies. Pre-submission, you're going to do some R&D studies. In this particular case, for package testing, you're probably going to do some testing to show that your packaging design functions the way that you intend it to. It protects your device the way you want it to, holds the device the way you want it to. The primary place where distribution testing comes in is for your regulatory filings. You're going to submit your reports along with all the other data that you have when you file for your device approval. On an approved device, you may also need to do some testing there. If you make a significant change, for example, changing the sterilization modality, or perhaps changing the packaging design, you may need to circle back and redo some testing. And it's also useful for CAPA investigations. If you've had some issues, you may need to do some testing to show that your risks can be mitigated and fixed for that issue. So let's go over kind of a high level, what is the purpose of packaging? And these criteria don't necessarily apply only to sterile medical device packaging, but really to all types of packaging that you will encounter in day-to-day life. So one of the purposes is to contain the product. It holds the product, it keeps it together, it prevents it from spilling out. The next purpose is to inform. All packaging is going to have some sort of labeling on it. In the medical device world, we're going to see what the product is, what its part number is, when its expiration date is, some information on how it needs to be handled or used, how it's sterilized, things like that. The packaging is also intended to protect the product. It's going to make sure that it makes it to its point of use in the condition it needs to be in order to be used. It's also going to display the product. This is less important in the medical device world because it's typically not sitting on a shelf in a store for a retail user. However, packaging for medical devices also needs to be designed to display the product to the end user in terms of like aseptic presentation or that thing. The last purpose of packaging is for transport. So your packaging is going to make it easier to safely move that product from the manufacturer to the warehouse, to sterilization facility, to the end user, and protect it along the way. So we're going to talk here about ISO 11607. Again, this is the primary guidance document for sterile barrier packaging. It's going to detail a lot of the requirements for validation and the test methods associated with that. This is required for FDA, CE mark. Many of the different regulatory bodies around the world are going to expect that you follow 11607 in your packaging validation activities. One of the things that it brings up in 11607 is that packaging tends to get less attention during the design process than the device itself does. And 11607 states that sterile barrier systems must be considered a component of the actual device. So I highly recommend when you're designing devices that packaging comes up early in the process and it's not an afterthought, that the packaging design is thought of early, tested along the way, before you get to the point where you're doing your distribution study and your shelf life studies. So you should have some of that characterization already done by the time you get to that point. So 11607 really highlights the importance of that sterile barrier and that packaging in the design of the device itself. So this is the typical test flow that you'll find from 11607. This test flow assumes that your sealing process of your packaging is qualified. You've done your IQ, your OQ, your PQ on that sealing process, and that you've already done some level of testing to show that you're getting the seals and the strength that you're looking for in your product. So before you get to this point, you need to make sure that you've proven that your packaging is sterilizable by the sterilization modality that you've chosen, whether it's ethylene oxide or radiation method or steam. Your packaging as well as your product needs to make sure that it withstands those sterilization modalities. And then also you want to show, before you get to this point, that the design meets the function as desired for your product. So again, you're protecting your product in the way it's intended to. You're containing the product in the way that you're intended to. Once you've determined all that, now you're ready to move into this testing. And this is where you're really going to challenge that package to show that it performs as desired. So we're going to start with baseline testing. This has no preconditioning. You send it to the sterilizer, then you test it right away. You're also going to do the distribution and transportation validation, which is what we're going to detail out today. And you're also going to have a shelf life stability validation, which would include both accelerated aging and real-time aging. And you're going to see that in each one of these stages, we're going to be doing package testing. So we're going to do two different tests, typically an integrity test and a strength test. The package integrity testing most commonly is a bubble leak test. There's also dye penetration testing that you can do there. The seal strength testing is most commonly a peel test, but there's some other tests like a burst test that you can do for seal strength testing as well. And we're going to do that testing again at each one of these points to show that there hasn't been any major changes to the performance of the package throughout the different types of tests that you're going to do. At the bottom of here, we got device validation testing. This is not part of 11607, but very commonly these devices are kind of along for the ride. You'll put some through the distribution simulation, and you'll want to do some device testing to show that your device maintains its functionality as well as the sterile barrier. Same with shelf life. So for distribution testing, what this testing is composed of is conditioning, drop and impacts, vibrations, compressions, and altitude simulations. And it's designed to challenge both the packaging and the product. It's primarily tested in laboratory conditions like STERIS has. It can be tested in the real world by actually shipping product back and forth from the locations that it's going to actually go. Testing in a laboratory is more controlled, and it's easier to hone in on where exactly the issues are. So in many ways, that's a superior way to test than the real world testing, but they're both acceptable. So we're talking about ASTM D4169. This is the main standard for distribution testing. There's also an ISTA standard that is also used, but less commonly in the medical device world. What you're going to do first when you're starting to map out how you're going to do your distribution testing, you're going to choose your worst case packaging. That's typically the lowest package level that's shipped, which is often a single box. But depending on your particular product, you may also want to consider whether there's other configurations that might be worst case. You might find that the entire pallet of a product is considered worst case for reasons specific to your product. You may want to consider testing both the full pallet and the individual box. The next step in designing your study is selecting an assurance level. So within D4169, there's assurance levels 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the highest level of intensity, 3 is the lowest level of intensity, and 2 is in the middle. Level 2 is most common for medical devices, but you do want to evaluate whether there's any specific reason why your device and the intended distribution of your device would need to be tested at a more rigorous level or at perhaps a less rigorous level, depending on your particular situation. So the next step of designing your distribution test is to choose the distribution cycle. So within ASTM D4169, as you can see here, there are 18 different distribution cycles. It's going to depend on what type of package you're testing, whether you're testing an individual box or whether you're testing a full pallet. You're also going to choose this based on what types of shipping your product is going to have. So whether it goes by truck, air, rail, and or sea. In the medical device industry, distribution cycle 13 is the most common for single packages. And then cycles 6 and 12 are the most common for larger packages or palletized loads. So I want to take a moment to talk about acceptance criteria. It's very important to establish your acceptance criteria prior to testing. And we'll talk about this a few times along the way as the webinar continues here. You want to consider any historical damage that you've seen in the field from similar products, or to try and set acceptance criteria around any issues that you're trying to design out with your packaging. ASTM has some recommendations for acceptance criteria, as you can see listed here. D4169 is not specific to medical device testing, so these criteria might apply better to other types of packaging. Really, with sterile medical devices, the ultimate acceptance criteria is that the sterile barrier must be maintained. So that's ultimately the goal of all your packaging, is to maintain that sterile barrier, so your product isn't going to potentially infect the patient. So the first step of the distribution sequence is to do an environmental conditioning step. These are the two most common. There's an ASTM sequence and an ISTA sequence. As you can see, they're similar. Basically, you're going to go through an ambient phase, a frozen or winter phase, again back to ambient, a tropical, high humidity, warm phase, and then a desert, which is hot and dry. What this is intended to do is expose the package and the product to all the different expected temperatures and humidities from the environmental conditions as you're transporting the product. This is performed in a conditioning chamber in the laboratory. These conditions are recommended by the standards, but they're not set in stone. So it may be that you have a really well characterized distribution of your product, and you know that it's never going to see these particular desert conditions, so we can reduce those, or perhaps it's going to be worse than what these conditions are, so you make it a little more rigorous. If you have the data to support those types of changes, you can do that. Some of the issues that are seen during conditioning, primarily the high humidity is the factor here. As you can see from the pictures here, these boxes have split seams, and you see kind of some swelling of the corrugate. Typically, this happens because your packaging material, the corrugate material, the boxes were not designed to meet these types of conditions. So the glues used weren't meant to be used in high humidity environments. You want to make sure when you're speccing out your boxes that you're making sure that they'll be able to withstand the types of conditions that you expect to see. The next test is a drop test. So this is meant to simulate rough handling. As we all know, boxes can be dropped very easily by the UPS guy or the guy in the warehouse. It happens. So this is meant to simulate all those types of drops. You can see the drop tester over here has a little platform that the box sits on. This drops away quickly and the box falls straight down. There is a sequence of testing defined in the standard. It's the dropping on various corners, edges, flat surfaces, and this is all based on which edge the manufacturer glue seal is. So you'll go through the sequence of drops on your box samples to hit all the different sides and corners. Some of the common drop testing issues, you've got your product that is now poking through your shipper. You've got splits in the box, in the tape, corners that are dented. It's important, again, we talked about setting your acceptance criteria, and it's important to do that because these are not necessarily failures of your study. Again, if you define your acceptance criteria as being that the sterile barrier has been maintained and the product is still functional, these could be determined to be acceptable. You may, again, if this is not desired, you can set your acceptance criteria that way, but again, that's why it's important to set that acceptance criteria early on prior to starting your testing. You can see some magnified photos here of damage to the actual sterile barrier, which does happen during this test at times. And this is typically seen during either bubble leak testing if it's a very small hole, or during visual inspection if it's a larger one. The next test in the sequence is a compression test. This is meant to simulate the compressive forces from stacking pallets or stacking boxes on top of one another. Again, it can be performed both on pallets or individual boxes. This is performed in the laboratory using a large compression tensile tester. You can just picture a large metal plate pushing down with a given amount of force on the boxes. So again, these forces are meant to simulate the forces seen sitting in a warehouse with pallets stacked on top of each other, like we have in the photo here, as well as during the actual distribution of the product. One thing to keep in mind here is that by this point of the sequence of testing, these boxes have already seen environmental conditioning, they've seen some of the drop testing. There's some damage already to these boxes. Within the D4169 standard, there is a calculation that's done to determine the amount of compressive forces that your product should be able to maintain. Because of the damage and conditioning that's already been done to some of these boxes, it's fairly normal to not meet those calculated loads. And again, setting your acceptance criteria correctly at the beginning makes that acceptable if your ultimate acceptance criteria is that sterile barrier being maintained. There is some risk during this test because these pallets can collapse and cause potential safety issues. So that's one thing you got to be careful about as you're doing this type of testing. Some of the common issues seen during this testing, you can see the shipper collapsed under the compressive forces, and then you can see boxes splitting, such as the picture here. The next stage of the sequence is the vibration test. This vibration test is made to simulate, again, the type of shipping that your product expects to see. You can see a couple different vibration profiles here for a truck delivery versus an air delivery. This is a photo of a vibration table. So it's basically a table that vibrates this over a period of several hours to mimic all the vibrations that your product is going to see driving down the road, flying in a plane, that sort of thing. Excessive movement of your product within the packaging is typically the cause of any issues that come out of this testing. So if your product is not tight enough in the boxes, you might see things vibrating and wearing away the packaging to create holes, or wear away the labels to essentially erase some of the data that's on there. So here's some, excuse me, some photos of some of the types of damage that you can see. Again, this is an actual other corner of an IFU that punctured the package, the pouch, over time through vibration. And you can see the product causing indentations in the pouch here. In the box itself, you can see, some damage to the box from this vibration as well. So I want to take a moment to talk about some recent updates to ASTM D4169. So in 2022, a new revision was released. The updates primarily focused around vibration. In the truck and air profiles, there's no longer assurance level 1, 2, and 3. Everything goes through the same sequence. There's low, medium, and high test levels. You can see down here, we now go through a low level for 27 minutes, a medium level for 10, and a high level for 3 minutes. This actually reduces the energy applied to the product from the previous revision of the standard, brings it more in line with the realistic vibrations that are seen during real distribution. So you can see the difference in the air profile in the previous revision versus the 2022 revision. The next test in the distribution sequence is a concentrated impact test. So this is intended to mimic something being dropped on your box, essentially, or your box being dropped on something that has an edge to it. So we basically have a 50 millimeter diameter bullet-shaped weight, and there's a couple different ways. The picture here shows a pendulum which swings and impacts the box that way. You can also drop it straight down on the surface of the box on the top. This standard applies only to single wall corrugated shipping containers with these conditions. So if you have a double wall or a stronger box, you don't need to do this test. Some of the common issues with this one, you're very commonly going to see this type of damage with some breakage along the sides of the boxes. Anything that goes too deep, you can actually see indentations on the internal pouches. You can see boxes split if, again, the box maybe doesn't have as much strength as it needs, or if some of that conditioning and the previous testing that's already been done has degraded the box material to a degree. The last part of the distribution sequence is a low pressure altitude test. This test applies only to non-porous packaging. So if your sterile barrier contains Tyvek or a paper breathable barrier, this testing is not required because your package is going to adjust with the air pressure around it. But if you do have a non-porous bag or pouch, such as a foil pouch or a poly pouch, this testing is required. So this is going to essentially simulate air freight or driving over high altitude. So you're going to pull a vacuum essentially to mimic that low pressure that would be seen. These are some of the issues that are encountered during this test. You can see that the bags essentially inflate or expand during this low pressure test. If there's not enough extra space in your box, you can actually see your box splitting open. You can see your tape broken. Here's one where the product is actually spilling out of the box after testing. You can also see degradation of your seal. So seal creep, if you imagine the strain being put on this seal here, is much greater in this expanded state than it is in its normal atmospheric conditions. And so if the seal is not strong enough, you could actually see that seal creep and break and compromise the sterile barrier. So that is it for the main part of the webinar.
Thanks again for joining us today. This concludes the webinar.